In the autumn of 1987, a construction crew renovating the abandoned Haverford Academy in Millbrook, Massachusetts, made a discovery that would chill investigators to their very core. Behind a false wall in the basement, sealed for over 60 years, they found a cache of documents, photographs, and medical records that revealed a horror so profound, so systematically concealed, that it had been erased from every official history of the institution. The workers who broke through that wall spoke of an overwhelming stench of decay, of rooms that seemed to whisper with the echoes of long silent screams. What they had uncovered was not merely evidence of neglect or abuse. It was proof of something far more sinister, something that challenged the very foundations of what the public had been told about one of New England's most celebrated charitable institutions. For decades, the Haverford Academy had been lauded as a beacon of progressive child welfare, a place where orphaned and abandoned children received not just shelter and education, but love, guidance, and hope for the future. The sisters who ran it, Eleanor and Margaret Haverford, had been celebrated as pioneers in child psychology and education, their methods studied and emulated across the country. But the documents hidden behind that basement wall told a different story entirely. They revealed that the Haverford Academy had been something else altogether, a laboratory where human beings, the most vulnerable among us, had been subjected to experiments that defied every principle of medical ethics and human decency. Tonight, I invite you to join me in uncovering a truth that powerful institutions have spent nearly a century trying to bury. This is not merely a story about two women and their crimes. It is a story about complicity, about the systematic suppression of inconvenient truths, and about the children whose voices were silenced not just by their tormentors, but by a society that chose to look away. What you are about to discover will disturb you. It will challenge your faith in the institutions we trust to protect our most vulnerable citizens. But it is a story that must be told, because the patterns revealed in these documents did not end with the Haverford sisters. They echo through our history, reaching into our present, reminding us that the capacity for evil often hides behind the most benevolent facades. The question is not whether you can handle this truth. The question is whether you can handle the weight of willful ignorance once you know it exists. Will you turn away, as so many did before, or will you bear witness to the forgotten children of Haverford Academy and ensure that their suffering was not in vain? To understand the full magnitude of what transpired at Haverford Academy, we must first examine the carefully constructed image that allowed it to flourish undetected for over a decade. In the aftermath of the Great War, America found itself grappling with unprecedented numbers of orphaned and abandoned children, casualties not just of conflict abroad, but of the influenza pandemic that swept through the nation like a scythe through wheat. Eleanor Haverford, 34 years old in 1919, possessed all the credentials necessary to command respect in the emerging field of child welfare. A graduate of Radcliffe College with advanced studies in psychology at Columbia University, she had spent 3 years working in settlement houses in New York's Lower East Side, where she claimed to have developed revolutionary methods for rehabilitating troubled children. Her younger sister, Margaret, 28, had trained as a nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital and specialized in pediatric care, bringing what appeared to be crucial medical expertise to their joint venture. The sisters' proposal to the Massachusetts State Board of Charities in early 1920 was nothing short of visionary. They would establish an institution that combined the latest advances in child psychology with progressive educational methods, creating not merely an orphanage but a comprehensive rehabilitation center that would transform damaged children into productive citizens. Their facility would serve as a model for the nation, demonstrating that with proper scientific methods, even the most troubled youth could be reformed and reintegrated into society. The timing could not have been more fortuitous. The progressive era had created an appetite for scientific solutions to social problems, and the Haverford sisters positioned themselves perfectly within this intellectual current. They spoke eloquently of environmental conditioning, of behavioral modification through systematic intervention, and of the malleability of the developing mind. Their language was precise, clinical, and utterly convincing to officials desperate for innovative approaches to an overwhelming crisis. When the Haverford Academy opened its doors in September 1920, It was housed in a magnificent Victorian mansion on 47 acres of rolling Massachusetts countryside. The building itself seemed to embody the sisters' stated philosophy, grand enough to inspire respect, yet warm enough to provide the sense of home that traumatized children so desperately needed. The grounds included vegetable gardens where children could learn agricultural skills, workshops for industrial training, and spacious classrooms equipped with the latest educational materials. The early press coverage was universally glowing. The Boston Globe described it as a beacon of hope in our troubled times, while the Springfield Republican praised the sisters' scientific approach to child rehabilitation. Visiting dignitaries from the State Board of Charities emerged from their tours with nothing but praise for the cleanliness of the facilities, the apparent contentment of the children, and the innovative methods being employed. But perhaps most importantly, the sisters had cultivated relationships with key figures in academia, medicine, and government who provided both intellectual credibility and practical protection. Dr. Harrison Webb, professor of psychology at Harvard University, served on their advisory board and regularly cited their work in his lectures. Dr. Margaret Sanger herself had visited the facility and proclaimed it a triumph of scientific child-rearing. Even Governor Calvin Coolidge, before his ascension to the presidency, had toured the academy and publicly endorsed their methods. The children who arrived at Haverford Academy came from the most desperate circumstances imaginable. Many were orphans of the pandemic, bewildered souls who had watched their families die in agony. Others were the products of broken homes, abandoned by parents who could no longer cope with the demands of raising children in an increasingly complex world. Still others had been removed from abusive situations, their small bodies bearing the visible scars of adult cruelty. These children, ranging in age from 5 to 16, were welcomed into what appeared to be a sanctuary. They were bathed, clothed in clean uniforms, fed nutritious meals, and assigned to dormitories that, while institutional in their uniformity, were clean, warm, and safe. The daily schedule was structured but not harsh. Morning exercises, academic classes, vocational training, and recreational activities, all designed to build character and skills. The sisters themselves were constant presences in the children's lives, moving through the corridors with quiet authority, their long skirts rustling against the polished floors. Eleanor, the elder and more austere of the two, handled the administrative duties and psychological evaluations, while Margaret oversaw the medical care and day-to-day operations. Together, they projected an image of competent, caring professionals, dedicated to the welfare of their charges. Yet even in those early days, there were whispers, barely audible concerns that would only later be understood as warnings. Some children seemed to change in ways that went beyond normal institutional adjustment. They became unnaturally quiet, unnaturally compliant, their eyes holding an emptiness that troubled visitors who looked closely enough to see it. But these concerns were easily dismissed as the natural result of traumatized children finally finding stability and structure. The sisters' reputation continued to grow throughout the early 1920s. They published papers in prestigious journals, spoke at conferences, and consulted with other institutions seeking to replicate their success. The Massachusetts legislature increased their funding, and inquiries arrived from as far away as California and Texas from officials interested in establishing similar facilities. By 1923, the Haverford Academy housed over 200 children and employed a staff of 37, including teachers, counselors, medical personnel, and support staff. It had become not merely an orphanage, but a substantial institution with significant political and economic influence in the region. The sisters had achieved everything they had set out to accomplish: respect, recognition, and the resources to pursue their work on an ever-expanding scale. But the facade of benevolence, no matter how carefully constructed, could not indefinitely conceal the reality of what was taking place behind the Academy's welcoming doors. The very success of their public image had created the conditions that would eventually lead to their downfall, as the attention they courted inevitably brought closer scrutiny from those who knew how to look beyond surface appearances. The first official expression of concern about the Haverford Academy came from an unexpected source. Dr. Samuel Wright, a physician from the neighboring town of Millbrook, had been contacted in the winter of 1923 by Sarah Coleman, A local woman whose position as a part-time laundress at the academy had given her access to areas of the facility that most visitors never saw. Dr. Wright, a man of considerable reputation who had served as a field surgeon during the war, initially dismissed Coleman's concerns as the nervous imaginings of an uneducated woman overwhelmed by the clinical atmosphere of a progressive institution. But Coleman was persistent, and her observations were disturbingly specific. She spoke of children who seemed to exist in a state of unnatural docility, of medical procedures being performed without proper documentation, and of sections of the basement that remained perpetually off-limits to all but the sisters themselves. What finally convinced Dr. Wright to investigate further was Coleman's description of the children's physical appearance. She had observed that many of the residents displayed symptoms that seemed inconsistent with the malnutrition and general neglect typically associated with orphan children. Instead, she described a pattern of what appeared to be deliberate physical modification. Children whose hair had been systematically altered in color and texture, whose posture and gait had been modified through unknown means, and whose natural childhood exuberance had been replaced by an eerie mechanical compliance. Dr. Wright's initial attempts to examine some of the children were politely but firmly rebuffed by the sisters. Eleanor Haverford explained that the children's psychological fragility required that all medical care be coordinated through the Academy's own medical staff to ensure continuity of treatment. She provided Dr. Wright with detailed medical records that appeared to document normal institutional care. But something in the precision of the documentation troubled him. The records were too perfect, too comprehensive, displaying a level of detail that seemed designed more to impress than to inform. The doctor's concerns deepened when he learned that the Academy's mortality rate, while not extraordinarily high by the standards of the era, displayed unusual patterns. Children who died at the Academy rarely succumbed to the typical diseases that plagued institutional populations. Instead, they died of what the records described as sudden constitutional failure, acute nervous exhaustion, or experimental complications, terminology that Dr. Wright found both vague and deeply disturbing. His suspicions were further aroused by the behavior of the Academy's staff. Those employees who had been with the institution since its founding displayed a remarkable uniformity of response when questioned about their work. They spoke in almost identical terms about the sisters' methods, using phrases that seemed rehearsed rather than natural. More troubling still, newer employees often left the Academy's employment after brief periods, and those who remained seemed to undergo a gradual transformation in their demeanor and speech patterns. Dr. Wright began to document his observations with the methodical precision that had made him a respected physician. He noted that children who had been at the Academy for extended periods displayed physiological changes that could not be explained by improved nutrition and medical care alone. Their reflexes were often abnormally heightened or suppressed. Their sleep patterns were rigidly regular in ways that seemed unnatural for children, and their emotional responses to stimuli were strangely muted or entirely absent. The breakthrough in Dr. Wright's investigation came when one of the Academy's former employees, a young woman named Mary Hutchinson, who had served as a teacher's assistant, approached him in the spring of 1924. Hutchinson had left the Academy after only 6 months, officially due to health concerns. But she revealed to Dr. Wright that she had been systematically excluded from certain areas of the facility and had witnessed procedures that violated every principle of child welfare she understood. Hutchinson described a hidden network of rooms beneath the Academy's main building, accessible only through a concealed entrance in the basement. She had glimpsed these rooms on only one occasion, when she had been asked to deliver supplies to what she had been told was a storage area. What she found instead was a complex of clinical facilities that bore no resemblance to the wholesome educational environment presented to the public. The rooms she described were equipped with restraint devices, medical apparatus of unknown purpose, and extensive record-keeping systems that documented procedures performed on children identified not by name, but by number. The walls were lined with charts tracking what appeared to be experimental protocols, and the air was thick with the smell of chemicals and something else, something organic and deeply unsettling that she could not identify. Most disturbing of all, Hutchinson had observed children in these rooms who displayed severe physical and psychological symptoms that had no counterpart in the healthy population of the Academy's public areas. These children moved with mechanical precision, responded to commands with robotic compliance, and showed no recognition of their former teacher when she encountered them in this underground environment. Dr. Wright's attempts to alert state authorities to these concerns met with polite dismissal. The Massachusetts State Board of Charities reminded him that the Haverford Academy was a model institution with impeccable credentials and impressive results. They pointed to the sisters' academic achievements, their published research, and the endorsements they had received from respected figures in medicine and education. Dr. Wright's allegations, they suggested, were the result of professional jealousy or personal animosity rather than legitimate concerns about child welfare. But Dr. Wright was not the only observer who had begun to notice troubling patterns. Father Michael O'Brien, the Catholic priest who served the rural communities surrounding the academy, had noticed that children from Catholic families who entered the institution seemed to lose all connection to their faith in ways that went beyond normal institutional secularization. When he requested permission to provide religious instruction to Catholic children at the academy, he was told that the sisters' scientific methods were incompatible with traditional religious practices. More significantly, Father O'Brien had observed that children who had been at the academy for extended periods displayed behavioral changes that seemed to extend beyond normal institutional adjustment. They spoke in remarkably similar patterns, used identical phrases when describing their experiences, and showed a uniformity of response that suggested something far more systematic than mere educational influence. The priest's concerns were shared by several local merchants and tradespeople who had regular contact with the academy. They noted that children who had been at the institution for more than a year often displayed an unsettling combination of advanced intellectual capabilities and profound emotional detachment. These children could perform complex tasks with remarkable precision, but seemed incapable of spontaneous emotional expression or independent decision-making. By the summer of 1924, a small network of concerned local residents had begun to share their observations about the Haverford Academy. Their concerns were not based on dramatic incidents or obvious abuses, but on the accumulation of subtle abnormalities that suggested something fundamentally wrong with the institution's operations. The children were too compliant, too uniform in their responses, too detached from normal human emotions and relationships. But the sisters' reputation and connections continued to protect them from serious scrutiny. When Dr. Wright attempted to organize a formal investigation, he found himself facing not only official indifference, but active resistance from powerful figures who had invested their reputations in the Academy's success. The very progressiveness that had initially attracted support for the institution now served as a shield against criticism, as questioning the sisters' methods was characterized as opposition to scientific advancement and social progress. The stage was set for a confrontation that would ultimately expose the true nature of the Haverford Academy's operations. But that reckoning still lay years in the future. And in the meantime, the work continued behind the Academy's walls, hidden from public view by a combination of institutional authority, social prestige, and the terrible human capacity for willful blindness in the face of uncomfortable truths. The breakthrough that would finally expose the true nature of the Haverford Academy came from Sarah Mills, 15 years old when she arrived in 1922. After 3 years of systematic abuse, she became the first survivor to provide a coherent account of what transpired in those hidden basement rooms. Sarah had been committed after her parents died in a factory fire. Intelligent and independent, she was assigned to what the sisters called advanced therapeutic programs, a privilege reserved for children who demonstrated exceptional potential. She was moved to a special basement dormitory where the other children displayed an eerie uniformity in their responses to authority. The transformation began subtly. Sarah's daily routine bore no resemblance to the wholesome environment shown to visitors. She was awakened at precisely 4:30 by a bell, subjected to repetitive conditioning exercises performed in perfect synchronization, accompanied by the recitation of phrases designed to erode individual identity and replace it with institutional loyalty. The medical examinations were invasive and extensive. Sarah underwent frequent blood draws, neurological tests involving electrical currents, and psychological evaluations designed not to understand her mental state, but to systematically break down her resistance. The sisters documented every response with clinical precision, referring to her as Subject 23 rather than by name. Most disturbing were the therapeutic sessions conducted by Eleanor Haverford in a stark room deep beneath the Academy's main building. Sarah was restrained in a chair equipped with leather straps during sessions that could last for hours. Eleanor employed sensory deprivation, chemical substances administered through injection, and psychological manipulation techniques that seemed designed to fragment Sarah's sense of self. The chemical substances produced effects far more profound than simple sedation. They altered her perception of reality, making her more susceptible to suggestion while fragmenting her memory. She would emerge with gaps in her recollection, unable to account for hours or days, aware only of a pervasive sense of violation and terror. Eleanor systematically erased Sarah's individual identity. She was forbidden to use her own name, required to respond only to her assigned number. Her personal history was gradually rewritten through repetitive suggestion, with Eleanor providing false memories of her life before the Academy. She was told her parents had abandoned her because she was fundamentally flawed. Margaret Haverford monitored Sarah's physical responses to treatments, adjusting dosages based on clinical observations rather than therapeutic need. She viewed Sarah not as a human being requiring care, but as a specimen whose reactions provided valuable data for ongoing research. The other children in Sarah's dormitory had undergone varying degrees of this treatment. Some had been so thoroughly conditioned they seemed incapable of independent thought, responding to commands with robotic precision while showing no signs of normal human emotion. Others had retreated into catatonic states, their minds unable to process the trauma. Sarah's salvation came through her ability to maintain a core of resistance. She developed techniques for preserving her true memories, creating mental compartments where she stored fragments of her authentic self while presenting the facade of compliance the sisters demanded. The opportunity for escape came in winter 1925, when a severe storm damaged the Academy's electrical systems and temporarily disrupted security measures. Sarah and two other children managed to break through a basement window and flee. The others were quickly recaptured, but Sarah reached a local farmer who was convinced by her detailed knowledge of the Academy's hidden operations. Sarah's testimony provided the first comprehensive account of the Academy's true purpose, a systematic program of human experimentation that went far beyond recognized psychological research. The sisters were attempting to create a new type of human being, one whose individual will had been completely subordinated to institutional control. Sarah Mill's revelations exposed not merely the crimes of two individuals, but a vast underground network operating beneath respectable society. The documents she smuggled out revealed connections stretching across New England, linking the Haverford Academy to a constellation of institutions engaged in similar experiments on vulnerable populations. The network had been constructed around Dr. Heinrich Brenner, a German psychiatrist who emigrated to the United States after the war. At Columbia University, he had encountered Eleanor Haverford and shared his theories about social optimization, the systematic reshaping of human behavior through controlled environmental conditioning. Dr. Brenner had been experimenting with these techniques in various institutional settings, using populations isolated from mainstream society. Orphanages, mental hospitals, and reformatories provided ideal laboratory conditions, as subjects were already marginalized and their treatment subject to minimal scrutiny. By 1925, the network included at least 12 institutions across 6 states. The Whitmore Institute in Connecticut focused on sensory deprivation effects on child development. The Riverside Reformatory in Vermont experimented with chemical substances that enhanced suggestibility. The Hancock Hospital in New Hampshire studied long-term effects of early psychological conditioning on adult behavior. Coordination between institutions was sophisticated and concealed. They shared research data, exchanged subjects for specialized treatments, and collaborated on experimental protocols. Children who disappeared from one institution often reappeared at another, their identities altered and histories rewritten. The network's operations were funded through state appropriations, private donations, and payments from organizations interested in the research. Corporations seeking workforce management methods provided support, as did government agencies interested in social control techniques. Respected academic institutions were involved in the network's activities. Several prominent universities provided research support, faculty expertise, and graduate students for data collection. Research was disguised as legitimate academic inquiry, with published papers presenting sanitized versions of results without revealing the true experimental methods. The network's ultimate goal was developing a comprehensive system for social engineering applicable to entire populations. The child experiments were merely the preliminary phase of a larger project aimed at creating mass psychological control techniques to reshape society according to their vision of optimal human organization. Dr. Brenner's framework divided human behavior into components that could be systematically modified through controlled environmental manipulation. By subjecting individuals to carefully designed conditioning sequences, he believed it possible to eliminate undesirable traits like independence and creativity while enhancing obedience and social conformity. Children serving as subjects were selected according to specific criteria. Orphans were preferred because their lack of family connections reduced outside interference. Highly intelligent children were particularly valuable because their responses could provide insights into controlling more capable individuals. The experimental protocols combined classical conditioning, drug therapy, sensory manipulation, and psychological coercion. Subjects were placed in controlled environments where every aspect of their experience reinforced desired behavioral patterns while eliminating competing influences. The systematic exposure began in spring 1927 when investigative journalist Martha Crenshaw from the Boston Herald received evidence that would launch the most comprehensive investigation of institutional abuse in Massachusetts history. Initially skeptical of stories about the Academy, Sarah Mill's corroborated testimony provided the foundation for serious investigation. Crenshaw's investigation began with the Academy's financial records, revealing irregularities suggesting funding from unidentified sources. Large cash payments from unknown donors, consulting fees from corporations with no apparent connection to child welfare, and research grants from organizations that existed only on paper. The financial trail led to Dr. Heinrich Brenner and his network of institutions. Through painstaking investigation, Crenshaw uncovered connections between seemingly independent facilities and documented the systematic nature of their experimental programs, revealing not individual crimes, but coordinated conspiracy. The breakthrough came when maintenance worker Thomas Hartwell, disturbed by what he observed in basement areas, provided access to hidden records. These detailed documents covered every aspect of experimental programs: chemical treatment protocols, psychological conditioning procedures, and outcome measurements for hundreds of subjects. The records revealed extensive outside support. Correspondence with government officials, academic researchers, and corporate executives demonstrated the experiments had been conducted with knowledge and approval from society's highest levels. Crenshaw's investigation culminated in articles published in the Boston Herald beginning August 1927 under the headline, "The Children of Haverford, a Scientific Horror." The articles provided detailed accounts of experimental programs, survivor testimonies, and documentary evidence exposing the network's full scope. Public response was explosive. Revelations that children had been subjected to systematic experimentation by respected professionals triggered a crisis of confidence in institutions meant to protect society's most vulnerable members. Demonstrations demanding justice were organized throughout New England. Eleanor and Margaret Haverford were arrested and charged with multiple counts of child abuse and conspiracy, though charges reflected only a fraction of their crimes. Dr. Brenner fled the country before arrest, taking crucial evidence and leaving behind disciples who would continue operating under different names. The trials were marked by attempts to minimize the crime's scope, portraying the sisters as well-intentioned professionals whose methods had been misunderstood. But survivor testimonies, supported by medical documentation and physical evidence, painted an undeniable picture of systematic abuse. Eleanor Haverford was sentenced to 25 years in prison, Margaret to 15 years. Both sentences were considered lenient, but represented maximum penalties under existing legal framework. Both sisters died in prison, never expressing remorse. The broader network largely escaped punishment. Several institutions were closed or reorganized, but many participants continued their careers elsewhere. The scientific community distanced itself from specific methods while defending the principle of experimental research on human subjects. The exposure marked a turning point in public awareness of institutional abuse potential and the need for greater research oversight. but it revealed the resilience of enabling systems and the difficulty of achieving accountability when crimes are committed by respected professionals within established institutions. The trials of Eleanor and Margaret Haverford mark not the end of their legacy, but the beginning of a systematic campaign to bury the truth that had been so painfully excavated. Even as the sisters began serving their prison sentences, powerful forces were already working to minimize the damage to the institutions and individuals who had enabled their work. The Massachusetts State Board of Charities, faced with the catastrophic revelation that they had not merely failed to protect children, but had actively facilitated their abuse, moved quickly to control the narrative. Official reports were heavily redacted, removing references to the broader network and the involvement of respected academic and government figures. The board's internal investigation, conducted with suspicious speed, concluded that the Haverford Academy had been an isolated case of individual malfeasance rather than evidence of systemic corruption. The records that had provided such damning evidence during the trials were declared state property and immediately sealed under the provisions of child welfare confidentiality laws. Court orders prevented journalists from accessing documents that might have revealed the full extent of the conspiracy, while survivors were discouraged from speaking publicly through a combination of legal intimidation and financial settlements that came with strict confidentiality agreements. Dr. Heinrich Brenner, safely ensconced in South America, continued his work under the patronage of governments eager to exploit his expertise in population control. The techniques he had pioneered at the Haverford Academy and its associated institutions found new applications in authoritarian regimes that had fewer concerns about ethical constraints or public oversight. The knowledge gained from the suffering of American children was exported to serve the interests of those who shared Brenner's vision of a perfectly controlled society. The academic institutions that had provided intellectual support for the network's activities underwent their own process of historical revision. Research papers that had cited the Academy's work were quietly withdrawn from circulation, while university administrators expunged references to their collaboration from official records. Professors who had served on advisory boards or provided consultation suddenly found their involvement characterized as minimal and inadvertent. Perhaps most tragically, the children who had survived the experiments found themselves facing a world that was eager to forget their experiences. Many had suffered permanent psychological damage that made it difficult for them to function in normal society, yet the very institutions that should have provided support were invested in denying the reality of their trauma. They were offered minimal compensation in exchange for their silence, and those who refused to cooperate often found themselves facing new forms of institutional harassment. Sarah Mills, whose courage had made the exposure possible, discovered that heroism came with a heavy price. Her detailed knowledge of the network's operations made her a liability to those who preferred to keep the full truth buried. She was subjected to surveillance, harassment, and character assassination designed to discredit her testimony and discourage other survivors from coming forward. The long-term consequences of the Haverford Academy extended far beyond the immediate victims. The techniques developed there influenced approaches to institutional management, educational policy, and mental health treatment for decades to come. Methods that had been refined through the systematic abuse of children were sanitized, repackaged, and introduced into mainstream practice under the guise of scientific advancement. The suppression of the full truth about the Academy also established a template for institutional response to scandal that would be employed repeatedly in subsequent decades. The combination of legal maneuvers, media management, and bureaucratic obfuscation that had been used to limit the damage from the Haverford revelations became a standard playbook for organizations seeking to minimize accountability for systematic abuse. Most disturbing of all, the network that had been exposed and supposedly dismantled in 1927 did not simply disappear. Like a virus that mutates to survive in a hostile environment, it adapted to new circumstances and continued its work under different names and in different settings. The fundamental ideology that had driven the original experiments, the belief that human beings could and should be systematically modified to serve institutional purposes, remained intact and influential. The children who had died in the Academy's basement rooms were buried in unmarked graves, their deaths attributed to natural causes or accidents and falsified records. Their families, where they existed, were told that their children had died peacefully in their sleep, victims of the same diseases that claimed so many institutional children of that era. The truth of their suffering was interred with their bodies, lost to a history that had been deliberately rewritten to serve the interests of their killers. As we stand here today, nearly a century after the Haverford Academy closed its doors forever, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The patterns of institutional abuse, systematic dehumanization, and willful ignorance that enabled the sisters' crimes did not die with them in their prison cells. They evolved, adapted, and found new expressions in contexts that remain disturbingly familiar to our contemporary experience. The techniques of psychological manipulation, pioneered in the Academy's basement rooms, live on in modified forms throughout our institutions. The careful management of information, the systematic erosion of individual resistance, the reduction of human beings to data points in grand social experiments, these methods have been refined and institutionalized in ways that would have impressed even Eleanor Haverford with their scope and sophistication. We see echoes of the network's approach in the continued willingness of respected institutions to sacrifice vulnerable populations for the perceived greater good. Children in foster care systems subjected to experimental treatments without meaningful consent. Elderly patients in nursing homes used as test subjects for pharmaceutical research. Prisoners subjected to psychological interventions designed to modify their behavior rather than address their needs. The academic and professional communities that enabled the Haverford Academy's work through their silence and complicity have not fundamentally changed their relationship to institutional power. The same dynamics that allowed respected scientists to rationalize the systematic abuse of children continue to operate today, protecting institutional interests at the expense of individual human dignity. Perhaps most troubling is the persistence of the fundamental ideology that drove the original experiments. The belief that certain populations exist primarily to serve the needs of those with greater power and authority. This ideology manifests in countless ways throughout our society, from the treatment of refugees and immigrants to the management of educational and healthcare systems that prioritize institutional efficiency over human welfare. The survivors of the Haverford Academy, those few who lived long enough to see their stories finally acknowledged, carried with them not just the scars of their individual trauma, but the weight of a truth that society was reluctant to confront. They understood, as we must understand, that their experiences were not aberrations, but extreme examples of tendencies that run throughout our institutional culture. Sarah Mills, in her final interview before her death in 1987, spoke words that should haunt us still. The worst part wasn't what they did to us in those rooms. The worst part was discovering that the whole world was complicit in looking away. They knew. They all knew. And they chose to let it happen because it was convenient, because it served their purposes, because confronting the truth would have required them to change. The documents discovered behind that basement wall in 1987 were not merely historical artifacts. They were a mirror reflecting the capacity for evil that exists within all human institutions when they operate without genuine accountability or ethical constraint. The Haverford Academy was not an anomaly, but a symptom of deeper pathologies that continue to infect our social systems. We honor the memory of those children not by treating their suffering as a historical curiosity, but by recognizing the continuing relevance of their experience to our own time. The mechanisms that enabled their abuse, the deference to authority, the compartmentalization of knowledge, the willingness to sacrifice individuals for institutional interests, remain powerful forces in our contemporary world. The question that confronts us is not whether such horrors could happen again, but whether we have the courage to recognize them when they do occur, and the determination to act upon that recognition despite the social and institutional pressure to remain silent. The children of Haverford Academy called to us across the decades, not seeking our pity but demanding our vigilance. Their voices silenced by systematic cruelty and institutional indifference ask us the questions we must ask ourselves. What horrors are we enabling through our own complicity and silence? What vulnerable populations are suffering while we avert our gaze? What institutions are we protecting at the cost of human dignity and individual worth? The basement rooms of the Haverford Academy have been sealed forever, but the forces that filled them with suffering remain active in our world. The only memorial worthy of those children is our commitment to ensuring that their sacrifice was not in vain, that we have learned to see, to speak, and to act when confronted with the systematic dehumanization of the vulnerable. The history we have uncovered tonight is not merely the past, it is the present, waiting to be recognized. The choice of what to do with this knowledge belongs to each of us. The children are still calling. The question is whether we will finally choose to listen,